What are the papers scattered on the table? And whose hand is this? By suppressing that information for a short while, we pay more attention. A closed framing is self-contained. The entire story is within the frame, and we have everything we need to understand it. So if an open framing creates questions, closed framings create answers. As soon as the cat's out of the bag, we can't go back to an open framing and expect the same sense of mystery and curiosity. Everything is now just an insert. And the long, slow reveal from before has now lost most of its punch because we already know the larger whole it's part of. Anytime we can make a scene move from open framings towards closed framings, the scene as a whole becomes more interesting than if we do it the other way around, and it's a very effective habit to develop. On a slightly larger scale, the logic of open and closed framing is key to deciding the cutting order of shots in a scene. Here we're starting on a single character, and we don't know that this is an open framing until we cut to reveal another character also in the scene. A classic comical trick is to play on assumptions, as here where the man is talking about something deeply personal, so we assume that he's maybe with a therapist. Cutting to reveal him in the center of the boardroom of a Fortune 500 company completely changes the meaning. A master is usually a very closed framing, and while starting a scene in a master works wonders for establishing geography, it eliminates any visual mystery right off the bat. But we don't need masters per se, because all we want is for the internal geography between the characters to make sense, which we can easily achieve by honoring the line or by creating overlapping groups. Masters work best for scenes where we need to deliver a lot of information quickly because one glance conveys the whole situation. A master or closed framing also works great to wrap things up, for instance after we've been covering intimate dialogue in close shots. We then cut to a wide shot to close the scene. But regardless of whether or not we use this to control the order of information, open framings tend to simply be more interesting because they create the feeling of shooting a small part of a world that's much bigger. Closed framings, on the other hand, give the feeling that the world has a definite size. In this scene, we're restricted by the size of the set, and whether we're on a soundstage or on location, the edge of the set is a realistic concern. So the tendency is sometimes to just barely squeeze the action into the set and cover it in the widest possible shot to capture the whole available scene. But after a while, we begin to feel confined, as if the world ends just to the left and the right of the frame. Which is true. The slightest pan reveals the edge. This often makes a set look like a set. What we really want is the feeling of a world that extends infinitely beyond the boundaries of the frame and where we're simply capturing the part that happens to intersect. So if we resist shooting the set as a whole and we stick to more open framings, we of course don't get to see all the production design, but the characters become much more part of a real environment. But this doesn't have to exclude wide shots. We just have to make it appear that the world continues outside the frame by having the surrounding environment spill into the frame. So we'll rearrange the set or deliberately bring in things to be cropped, starting with a table, a counter in the background, some foreground, and by placing some extras over the edge of the frame, making the scene part of a limitless world. Open framings are also useful when we need to make a few characters look like a lot. Here we want to make 15 extras look like a crowd, and using a slightly wide-angle lens, the framing is about closed. With all the extras in the shot, we get the feeling we're seeing exactly 15 extras and not a crowd. If we tighten the shot, they spill over the edge, but it still feels like we're seeing the whole thing. What we should do instead is create an intensely populated shot with enough spill over the edges that we believe the environment looks the same. So we'll start by staging the characters deeper and closer together, and use a longer lens which automatically makes the frame more open, at the same time compressing the space. We then make sure to fill in any gaps around the edges so the world is infinite. With crowd sound effects added, this can be quite convincing. Finally, open and closed framings can effectively be mixed within a single shot. Here the man is waiting to talk to the woman about a serious error in some paperwork. So the framing is closed on her in the papers, but open on the man, and we don't know what state of mind he's in. As we crane up, we gradually find out. In the next number of chapters, we'll run down some simple geometric shapes to align cameras and characters by. These shapes are not goals by themselves, but they can be an aid in structuring coverage because once we spot a shape in a scene, we have a set of techniques ready to go with that shape. Placing cameras at right angles can be a useful alternative to over the shoulders when the characters are standing at angles to each other. As we cut between the cameras, each shot is a frontal view of the character in focus and a side view of the other, making each shot personal to each character. Putting the cameras out here, we're doing the same thing, but from outside the action. The side view is now the main view on each character. Whether or not to stage in right angles is a style choice, but it can be effective when characters are also arranged in right angles. This happens surprisingly often. Here the man is trying to communicate with a woman, but she's keeping to herself, so let's put in one camera for her and a right angle camera for them both. Let's do a close shot version of the last camera as well. Starting in the single shot on the woman, this layout gives us very expressive coverage to edit from. The main benefit of right angle cameras is that they very naturally isolate characters and can make shots more individual. Outward cameras are placing cameras outwards from a central point. This can be a manageable way to cover scenes that easily have many lines like this scene where the characters are sitting around a table. The philosophy is to aim all cameras out from the center, but in reality we'll be backing up most of the cameras to get a better framing. So starting with a shot on the man in the suit, we'll put in a camera for the women and one for the men. Let's also do a camera on the blue woman and one on the blue man. Since we're staying within all lines, the coverage makes sense, at least in theory. Practically, cutting between 360 degrees of cameras can sometimes feel like we're twisting our necks. For that reason, it can be a good idea to limit the arc in editing and never cut around in a full circle. So we'll avoid cutting from this camera to this camera. Instead, we'll hinge on the man in the suit to get back and forth, as he seems to be the moderator in the scene anyway. As in choosing a major coverage angle, starting coverage outwards from a central area is a good strategy because it creates less line issues. With parallel cameras, all cameras are shooting in the same direction. This produces very two-dimensional coverage that can be a style in itself. Parallel cameras can work great on a limited set that doesn't allow a lot of freedom to pick angles. Here we really only need a back wall. But since every shot is from the same angle, spatial continuity is harder to maintain. Keeping the space consistently in front of the characters helps. We're keeping the moderator in the center, which also helps. We've additionally set up some cameras to create overlapping groups. In a scene like this, where spatial continuity is easily a problem, it can be a good idea to shoot a full master because the ability to cut back into a master at any time will be useful in editing. Character arrangements often naturally fall into shapes that resemble letters of the alphabet, like I, A, L, U, and O. It's sometimes considered a rule to actually stage characters according to these shapes, but that can sometimes seem staged. Our goal here is merely to have a library of possible camera plots ready for when we find ourselves in shapes that are close to them, which happens often. The I shape is the simplest one and has the characters arranged in a straight line. Two-character dialogue is often automatically an I shape and is easily covered in a selection of reverse shots and perhaps a master. When more characters are added to the straight line, the best approach is to think in terms of creating various groupings and pivoting on certain characters to help glue the scene together. So let's create some groups starting with a 3-shot here and a reverse 3-shot to match. Let's also create 2 over the shoulders here for dialogue between the woman and the red man. At some point the woman turns and we'll set up 2 reverse shots for this dialogue as well. Let's also add a close-up on her. We've set up the camera so that the woman can be used as a pivot. As we cut between the closer shots, she's the common denominator between the 2 major groups. It's a matter of taste how much coverage to add. This scene is overcovered as it is. There's no formula for which groups to create because it depends on what the scene is about, but the sooner we can make the selection, the less we'll have to shoot. The shape is the same regardless of which way the characters are facing, so if we face them outwards, we should be able to use the same coverage with no change. Here we're first cutting back and forth between the reverses in the first group. We pivot on the woman as we go to the second group, and the other reverse. The eye shape appears within most other shapes, so anytime we want some local coverage, we can treat that part of the scene as such. Here, the three lined up characters are an obvious eye shape, so we'll go in and create some subgroups of the parts of the conversation that we're interested in. Whether or not to deliberately stage in a shape like this is optional, but doing so makes planning shots extremely easy. Here, two characters are together and one is at a distance. Still, we place them in a line to make coverage very straightforward. The A shape consists of three characters arranged in any kind of triangle and is a shape that appears in one form or another in the vast majority of scenes. So it's extremely useful to have camera plots at hand for it. The easiest way to cover this is as a series of reverse shots in various sizes, starting with an external reverse covering all three, and a matching reverse here. Let's also do an internal reverse on the woman, an internal reverse two-shot on the men, and a close-up for each of the men. For now, we're really only using one line, and since all the cameras are on the same side, we can cut freely between them. The only two cameras that don't cut well together are the close-ups on the men because they're nearly identical. We're trying to detract attention from this by having the background be different in each shot, but it's still a fairly jerky cut. Simply bridging the cut with a different shot solves it. So we're basically covering it as regular dialogue, except one side has two characters. But we don't have to be stuck on one side of the line. If the men are to have dialogue, we'll put in a reverse pair for that, which creates another line here. This camera is easy to get to because it's out with the other cameras, but cutting to this camera could cross any number of potential lines and we need to hinge in and out of it. Starting in the original cameras, the most logical choice is to hinge through the reverse that's already on our side of the current line. As soon as we've cut through it, going to the far camera seems logical. For getting back out, all of these cameras are technically on the right side of the new line, but since we still remember the previous line, it's better to hinge back as well. So starting in the far camera, we go back to the hinge from where we can cut to any of the original cameras. But the scene actually has some built-in hinges already. If we forget about the woman for a moment, both the internal two-shot on the men and each of the close-ups are already in a master relationship to the second line. So if we're coming from external dialogue and we want to go to the far camera, the two-shot could be just as useful a hinge. An issue here, though, is that in this shot, the line we're coming from is still fresh in our memory, and we'd need to wait a little as we get used to the new line before cutting to the far camera. So using the near reverse to hinge is still the better solution. With the A shape a little wider, we're likely to want to do dialogue between the central character and each of the other characters. The simplest way to get them covered is to place three internal cameras outward from the center, which will allow us to cut the scene in any order. But doing external reverse pairs is a little trickier. We'll first put in a pair for the red man and the woman. We're placing the pair on this side of their line so the internal cameras can work as close-ups, but also because it keeps us inside the action. If we'd put the cameras out here, we'd separate the two characters and the dialogue would be more private. Out here, we wouldn't be able to use the internal cameras. Let's place another reverse for the two men, also inside the action. The easiest way to connect all the cameras in the scene is to use the red man's close-up as a hinge. From here, we can get to all the other cameras. We get easily into the external shot on the woman, the reverse on the red man, and back into the close-up. We get easily into the external shot on the blue man, the reverse on the red man, and back into the close-up. Since these two cameras are on the same side of both lines, we can also go directly between them. Cutting between them, the red man switches sides in the frame, but since we understand it as two overlapping groups, it makes sense. Going between the two other external reverses naturally won't work. Starting in the first one, the jump across two lines is very distracting. But let's go ahead and look at what happens if we place one of the reverse pairs outside the dialogue. Here we have almost no way to get into these reverses, so this camera is the only choice for a hinge. From the hinge, let's look at the two only cutting options, starting with this one. We'll then be pivoting on the red man to the similar reverse on the woman. He stays in the same part of the frame, and the two other characters simply replace each other. This can get jumpy if the shots don't look different enough, so let's bring in some background. Pivoting back, the cut makes more sense, but can still be a little on the edge because the shots are so similar. Hinging to the other reverse is a smoother cut, but causes us to leap around more, which can sometimes be startling as well. As we go from one reverse to one on a different line, we're still pivoting on the man. There's no preference here because both work, and it's a choice we can make in editing. Our only concern when shooting is to make sure to build in a hinge. If we want some master coverage of the A shape, a thing that works great is to place one line straight down the center and position the master on it, and also a mirror on the other side. Cutting back and forth, both cameras are exactly centered, and each shot is a mirror of the other, which can be interesting coverage by itself. But the beauty is that just as with a close-up on the man, we can get to and from any camera in the scene from these masters. The L shape is a variation of the A shape where two characters are lumped together and one is further away. Given everything we've already looked at, this should be extremely easy to cover. With the main conversation being between the women, we'll put in two reverses. They're on this side of the line to be nearer any conversation with the man. This camera will probably be our hinge, so we'll put in an internal shot on the man on this side of the line. Let's also create an internal two-shot on the women to mirror. When the conversation turns to the man, if the red woman is mainly doing the talking, we'll put in a close-up on her to mirror his close-up directly. If this is a short scene, we've already overcovered it, but let's top it off with an external reverse here and an external reverse here. So starting in the external reverses between the women, we're cutting back and forth since this is the main dialogue. Out in the hinge, we suddenly cut to the close-up on the man as he makes a comment. In the two-shot on the women, they turn to him. Here we do a bit of external reverse dialogue between the two groups. At some point, the conversation becomes more personal between the man and the red woman, so we cut between his close-up again and her close-up. Back in this external reverse, the women stand for a bit, then again turn to each other. We cut back into the hinge, and then the reverse on that line. Back in the hinge, we cut to the man's close-up again for a silent reaction. With the L shape, let's introduce a unique way of cutting across the line. Since the L shape closely resembles the A shape, the main difference is that the dialogue centers around two characters with a third occasionally participating, in this case the blue man. With two internal reverses on the red man and woman, we'll put a third camera for the blue man out here, still on our side of the line, and a close-up on him as well. Obviously, we'll be able to cut between these three cameras, bringing in the blue man with this camera. Using that as a hinge, we can cut to the close-up, back into the hinge, and out to the reverse dialogue. That's doing it by the book, but the unique thing about this setup is that we don't need the hinge. Starting a reverse dialogue between the red man and woman, we'll be skipping the hinge and cutting straight to the close-up on the blue man. As we cut, it makes just as much sense as it would have using a hinge, even though we're jumping the line. Cutting back into reverse dialogue, the blue man was looking at the red man, so we'll cut back to him. The reason it works is that in the close-up, we really don't know how far back we are. We could produce almost the exact same shot by being back here with a longer focal length. So even though we're jumping the main line, we don't necessarily know it. This is useful because it allows us to do close-ups on all the characters on the other side of the line. Here we're again cutting back and forth in reverse dialogue between the red man and woman, but the close-up will be on the blue woman deeper into the scene. We cut to her for a comment, but the close-up is likely to be perceived as being on our side of the line. Even if it isn't, it's close to being legal, and if we've previously established geography with a master, we'll get away with it. This technique doesn't look pretty on paper, but it works and is invaluable when we're dealing with a lot of characters. In this chapter, we'll look at the U, I, and O shapes, which are very similar and can be handled using identical techniques. The U shape has two rows of any number of characters and one center character to complete the U. If we remove the center character, we're left with two I shapes across from each other. If we bring him back and add a character at the other end of the table, we have a full circle or O shape. The main difficulty here is that we're dealing with a lot of characters, and with dialogue crisscrossing the scene, we need a way to manage what is easily a very complex scene. A thing to notice is that it's generally easier to cover the scene from inside and outwards. If these three characters are having dialogue, this creates three lines, and staying within them, we can cut back and forth as we please. As soon as we move outside and do over the shoulders, we'll be crossing lines in every cut, and we'll have to work out a plan for hinging. A second thing to notice is that with a master of the scene, getting coverage and managing lines becomes much more forgiving because the geography is fresh in our minds. And if we later find ourselves entangled in lines or have lost orientation, there's no faster way to get out than with a master, even if it means crossing a line on the way out. A third thing to notice is that doing groupings that include more than one character is much better than doing single shots on each character. Not just because we have less cameras to shoot, but because overlapping characters and scenery make spatial continuity easier to maintain. This means that even if the red man is mainly doing the talking, we frame the shot to include the extra next to him, and this will also be her shot if she has dialogue. A last thing to notice is that the dialogue is usually between very few characters and the rest function as extras. So if we remove the others, we can easily cover the scene using techniques we've already looked at. Here the dialogue centers around the man in the suit and the blue woman, with occasional comments from the others, so let's try the line-crossing L shape we looked at in the last chapter. We'll simply put in two reverses for them, a master, an insert on the blue man and the red woman, and an insert on the red man and the surrounding extras. Starting in the master, we'll cut to one reverse on the main dialogue, and the other. Then sneak across the line to this shot, and to this shot, back and reverse dialogue, and so on. Finding a shape based on the characters that really matter quickly gives structure to the coverage, and adding all other cameras according to these lines gives us more than enough to cover most scenes with. But let's look at a different technique that can handle any scene regardless of how complex it is. When the dialogue is all over the place, and no simple technique will solve it, the trick is to draw every conceivable line in the scene and then place cameras that work for as many lines as possible. This will temporarily make the diagram look overwhelming. The obvious lines come from dialogue. Here the CEO at the end of the table talks with a blue woman. He also talks with a red man, and with a red woman, who also talk with each other. At some point, the blue woman comments on something the red woman is saying. And at some point, the blue man comments on something the red man is saying, after which the CEO adds a remark. Other lines come from reactions, or from anywhere there's a tension between characters. This extra will have a reaction to something the red man says, which creates a line here. And this extra will have a reaction to something the red woman says. For the beginning of the scene where this line is active, we'll start with a wide over the shoulder on the woman, a close-up on her, and a close-up on the CEO, which we've placed like this so it'll work for dialogue with the other characters as well. For the main dialogue between the CEO and the red man and woman, which happens within this triangle, we'll add two more outward cameras, and all three will cut smoothly as long as we're inside the triangle. For the dialogue between the red man and woman, we'll also add a pair of external reverses, which we'll need to hinge in and out of because we'll be